There were no sign of our survival. Nothing for miles. My little sister, her eyes were closed. I was terrified she might slip into hypothermia. All I could see was the fear in their eyes. Heavy rain, a raging windstorm, and thunder. Watch how my simple hike turned into a terrifying nightmare. I was 18, and it was during the COVID pandemic. I was tired of being stuck at home. So I planned a short hiking trip with my siblings. It was our first time going on a hike without my parents. When we started, the weather was beautiful. By about mid-morning, we had reached the top. The view was amazing. Around noon, I noticed a few clouds gathering on the horizon. I didn't think too much of it at first, but after an hour or so, those clouds started getting darker. A low rumble of thunder made me look at the time. It was about 2 in the afternoon. I told my siblings that we should head back if we wanted to avoid the storm. We began our descent, but as we walked, the wind picked up. The clouds seemed to roll in faster than I expected. The air got cooler, and I could sense that a heavy downpour was on the way. My younger brothers started hurrying down the trail, and I was right behind them, telling them to stay together and watch their footing on the slippery rocks. Suddenly, the rain started. First a light drizzle, then a complete downpour. Within minutes, we were soaked to the skin. The trail became muddy, and it was hard to see where we were going. I checked my phone for a weather update, but there was no signal. The thunder boomed overhead, making my youngest sister jump. I tried to reassure her that everything would be okay, but inside, I was worried. Because we wanted to get home faster, we made the mistake of taking a shortcut off the main trail. We thought it would save us time, but it only made things worse. The path we took was actually used by woodcutters. After about 10 minutes, the trail vanished into thick undergrowth. We realized too late that we were completely lost. The trees were dense, and it was hard to see more than a few feet ahead. All we could see was lightning streaking across the sky, and the thunder sounded louder and louder. The wind whipped the branches, and we heard the crack of wood as some limbs snapped off. Rain pelted our faces so hard that it stung. My youngest sister started shivering, and her lips turned pale. That's when my heart really began to pound. I was responsible for everyone, and I had no idea which way led back to safety. All of a sudden, I remembered a survival tip from a show I used to watch. If you're lost in a forest, find a river or stream and follow it downstream because it often leads to a town or at least a road. So I told my siblings to stay put for a moment while I looked around. The forest was full of dripping leaves and the sound of water everywhere. It was hard to distinguish a stream from the rain, but after walking a short distance, I found a small river. I called out to my siblings, and we decided to follow the river's flow. We trudged along the riverbank, trying to keep our balance on the wet rocks. The rain kept coming, and the wind gusted so strongly that a couple of times we had to stop and brace ourselves against trees. My youngest sister was shaking with cold, and I worried she might slip. At one point, I gave her my jacket, even though I was shivering myself. We had to walk carefully because the bank was muddy and slippery. After about half an hour, we came to a waterfall. It wasn't huge, but there was no safe way to climb down or go around. The area around the waterfall was rocky and steep. We realized we couldn't continue downstream, so we had to turn back. That was a huge blow to our morale. The sky was darker than ever, and it felt like the storm wasn't going to let up anytime soon. By then, the temperature seemed to have dropped even more. My youngest sister was in tears. She was cold and scared. My other siblings were also looking exhausted, and I could see the fear in their eyes. I had to think quickly. I spotted a nearby hill. Nothing too high, but it seemed like it might give us a better view of the area. Maybe we could spot a road, a house, or some sign of civilization from up there. So we changed direction and started climbing the hill. It was slippery, and at times, I had to grab onto tree trunks and branches to pull myself up. My siblings followed, trying to step where I stepped. My youngest sister could barely walk by then, so I lifted her onto my back. She clung to me, trembling, and trying not to cry. Every so often, I would whisper to her that it was going to be okay, and that we'd find help soon. When we reached the top of the hill, The wind was even stronger, but at least we had a slightly clearer view. We shouted for help, calling out as loudly as we could, but no one answered. The forest stretched out all around us, with only a few open areas that looked like farmland. Then, in the distance, I spotted what looked like an old barn or farmhouse. It was hard to see through the sheets of rain, but it was definitely a structure of some sort. That small sign of hope gave us a burst of energy. We carefully made our way down the hill toward that building. The ground was muddy, and we kept slipping, but we were determined. As we got closer, we saw that it was indeed an abandoned farm building. A small wooden shack with a partly collapsed roof. Still, it was better than nothing. We hurried inside. The interior was dark and smelled of wet wood. The roof leaked in a few places, but it provided enough shelter from the wind and rain that we could catch our breath. My youngest sister was shivering uncontrollably by then, and her eyes were closed. I gently laid her on a dry patch of floor and felt her forehead. She was cold as ice, and I was terrified she might slip into hypothermia. I began searching around the shack for anything that could help us. My brothers joined in, rummaging through old crates and broken furniture. By some miracle, we found a small container of petrol, a box of matches that was damp but not completely soaked, and a pile of dry grass in a corner that must have been sheltered from the rain. My heart raced with relief. We could make a fire. I quickly gathered the dry grass and any bits of dry wood we could find. Then, I carefully used the matches to light a small flame. The grass caught fire, and we fed it with more bits of wood until we had a decent little fire going. I could feel the warmth on my hands and face, and it was the best feeling in the world at that moment. We huddled around the fire, trying to get my youngest sister as close as possible without burning her. She opened her eyes briefly, but she was still very weak. I kept talking to her softly, telling her she was safe now. Time passed slowly in that shack. The rain kept pounding on the roof, and the wind howled outside. My siblings and I were all soaked, shivering, and exhausted, but the fire gave us some hope. We tried our phones again and again, but there was still no signal. We decided to wait it out for a bit, hoping the storm would ease. I remember looking at my watch and seeing that it was already past 9 in the evening. We were supposed to be home by 6. Our parents must have been so worried. Eventually, around 10 o'clock, I checked my phone again, and this time there was a faint signal. My heart leaped. I immediately called my father. My voice was shaky, and I had to speak loudly to be heard over the sound of the storm. I told him where I thought we were, describing the path we had taken, the hill we climbed, and the river we followed. I also mentioned the abandoned farm building, hoping he'd have some idea of where we might be. He told me to stay put, and promised to come as soon as he could. I looked around at my siblings and told them our parents were on the way. I could see the relief on their faces, especially my older sister, who had been trying her best to keep everyone calm. We waited another 2 hours before we heard a familiar shout outside. My father and a couple of his friends had come with flashlights and warm clothes. I cannot describe the feeling of relief that washed over me. My siblings and I rushed to the doorway of the shack, and my youngest sister managed to sit up, though she was still weak. They wrapped us in dry blankets, gave us some hot drinks from a thermos, and checked to make sure we were all right. My father looked both worried and proud at the same time. He told me I did a good job protecting my siblings. The journey home took about 3 more hours, because we had to move slowly through the forest in the dark. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the ground was still very slippery. My father and his friends guided us, using their flashlights to find a safer route. We eventually reached a small, dirt road where they had parked their truck. All of us piled in, grateful to be out of the forest and on our way home. When we finally got home, it was close to 3 in the morning. That experience changed the way I look at nature. I still love hiking and exploring, but now I always check the weather forecast carefully and make sure I have proper gear. So that's my story. It's a true incident that happened a few years ago, and it still feels fresh in my mind. Thank you, everyone, for being with me all this time. If you liked this story, please like, share, and subscribe.